Hello again. This is the first lecture for supernatural fiction for our class introducing the Victorians. Our Victorians are the foundation of the ghost story as we write it in the 21st century. They've never failed us. I wanted to give you a bit of the history and background of the ghost story and to let you know what my sources are for that. I am drawing from two introductions to 19th and 20th century stories compiled by the Oxford University Press, and the editor is Michael Cox. He's a true expert on ghost stories. He anthologizes them. I recommend his collections. And Edith Wharton in a short book that she wrote called The Writing of Fiction, and she set down some rules about ghost stories. So those, it's Michael Cox and Edith Wharton as the two authorities I'm drawing from. And for the stories that we'll be looking at this entire, over the course of the next 6 weeks, I am heavily borrowing from a great anthology which came out about 5 years ago called Ghost, 100 Stories to Read with the Lights On. This is an absolute tome. I would recommend it. It's just extremely heavy. It's edited by Louise Welsh, who's here at the University of Glasgow, where I'm broadcasting from tonight. And it goes back 1,000 years, and then right up to the present time with some of the authors. So I absolutely love it. It's extremely dense and fascinating, and a lot of the stories are under 10 pages. So it's just an absolute treasure trove. So to dive in with the roots of the ghost story, which is where we will start. This is what Edith Wharton said in The Writing of Fiction. The use of the supernatural seems to have come from mysterious Germanic and Armorican forests, from lands of long twilights and wailing winds, and it certainly did not pass through French or even Russian hands to reach us. Sorcerers and magic are of the south, the Mediterranean. The witch of Theocritus brewed a brew fit for her sister hags of the Scottish heath, but the spectral apparition walks only in the pages of English and Germanic fiction. So Edith Wharton identifies the start of the ghost story to, it's actually the same place as fairy tales, and that is in the English Moors and the Germanic tales. But I think Louise Welsh would say it's older. The ghost story tradition is older than that. Ghosts themselves have an ancient cultural lineage, but literary ghost stories, those deliberate fictional constructs that are designed to make their readers feel pleasurably afraid, are of relatively recent origin. Their main characteristics were developed during the first half of the 19th century, and from the earliest stages of their evolution, they reflected the ordinary landscapes and circumstances of contemporary life. This indeed was what distinguished them from their immediate literary antecedents, most notably the Gothic romances of the late 18th century. Where Gothic fiction had been romantically remote in its settings and often flamboyantly atemporal, ghost stories anchored themselves firmly in the contemporary or near-contemporary here and now. Domestication of both settings and incidents was the crucial distinction between the Victorian ghost story and its Gothic relations, and this has continued to be a defining characteristic of the whole genre. Ghost stories generally, though not exclusively, concern themselves in some way with the returning human dead, but they must be set in a recognizable actuality. This provides a clear distinction with works of supernatural fantasy set in worlds that are completely imaginary and inherently impossible. Ghost stories operate in familiar environments in which ordinary human beings are engaged in ordinary activities. We need to know that the fictional world is our world, that the characters are, in a sense, our representatives. The trick of a good ghost story, in other words, is to make us feel that such things may happen to us. For it to work in literary terms, the supernatural requires firm grounding in the natural. The more banal the setting, the greater the impact of its violation of the normal. So really, this is the basis that the ghost stories that are most effective are in the present. They take place now, even when we are using the trappings or the building blocks, that are given to us by another era, whether that's atmosphere or whether that's suspense. These different elements get mixed into our time, and what we present is a picture of where we are now. Even if you're dealing with antique collectors, try to set them in 2019. That's just a big hint as far as what scares us, because we like to read those things that are possible, that we can identify as real, and real is associated with the contemporary. So that is the first principle. The Victorians gave way to the Edwardians, and Edwardians would include M.R. James, who you will read this week, and The Haunted Dollhouse. And this is from Michael Cox's Introduction. The increasing pace of material change did not extinguish supernatural fiction. It was, on the contrary, a prerequisite for its development. To the ascendancy of secularism and science, supernatural fiction offered a counterbalancing viewpoint. Ghost stories have continued to flourish in the technological culture of the 20th century. Conservative in style and form, but perpetually adaptive to the mood of the times, and still providing alternative readings to reality. The ghosts of fiction were not killed off by the advent of the electric light, the invention of the telephone, the coming of a motor car, or even by the once unthinkable horrors of technological warfare. Instead, they took over the trappings, landscapes, and cultural assumptions of the 20th century for their ancient purposes, as they've done in the 19th, and so continued against all odds to thrive. The ghost story is an extremely adaptable form of fiction. It just moves with the times, it changes with the times, and it always makes the best of those old conventions. What M.R. James gave to us, he was a sort of spokesperson for the ghost story. He used to broadcast his own stories over the radio. He would read his own stories, and had a huge following at the beginning of the 20th century. And he is not a relation of Henry James, but they were both equally influential. I think that M.R. James is probably more what you have in mind with traditional ghost stories. He's dealing with settings that are involve maybe graveyards, archaeological finds, museums. In this case, this week, a dollhouse, so an antique collector's item. He had 5 criteria for what needed to be addressed by the ghost story. Number 1, each story should reveal to the reader a spectacle of the returning dead or their agents or their actions. 2, there must be a dramatic interaction between the living and the dead, more than often not with the intention of frightening or unsettling the reader. 3, the story must exhibit clear literary quality. 4, there must be a definable Englishness about the story. Well, that one maybe we can dispense with. And 5, finally, the story must be relatively short. Ghost stories are inherently limited in form and dynamic potential. The successful ghost story, like the successful detective story, depends on using conventions creatively. This is about reader expectations and that contract that you make with the reader when you write a ghost story, which is all important because ghost stories are truly entertainment. So you do want to think about what your effects are on the reader. Have you successfully kept them hanging, spooked them, made your reader afraid, but in a way that is actually pleasant? The ghost story's basic dynamics are settled in the reader's expectations at the outset. We know that we are to be shown a climactic interaction between the living and the dead, and usually expect to be unsettled by the experience. The skill comes when the author is able to work closely with the limited conventions of the form, whilst at the same time reassembling familiar components into something that can still engage and surprise. To some extent, this requires a certain complicity between the author and reader, whereby the latter becomes a willing accomplice in the whole design. And just a few more points. So Victorians actually gave us the rise of realism, where factual detail give us the components for recognizing ourselves in our own time, and thus believing that a ghost could exist. From there, the late 19th century was the era of the decadence, and Michael Cox says about that group, which includes Oscar Wilde, and Oscar Wilde also wrote ghost stories. As the century drew to a close, the ghost story proved to be remarkably resistant to mainstream literary influences. In the wider sphere of supernatural fantasy, the decadence produced a strain of lyrical atavistic horror in the work of Arthur Machen. But Machen's stories belong to a different tradition than the ghost story proper, a literary tradition independent of, but clearly part of the British rootstock that flourished in New England. So you have the British side of the ocean, and then New England's Hawthorne and Edgar Allan Poe, and we will read a bit of Hawthorne actually for this class. And I wonder how many of you are fans of Poe and his tales. They are right on the what I call the horror border, which starts to go in a different direction. From decadence, the new contribution of the 20th century was something I will call obliquity. The chief figure of obliquity was Henry James, who produced ghost stories increasingly oblique in style throughout his career. Ghost stories were being written by mainstream literary figures and by large numbers of professional writers who combined writing ghost stories with other forms of fiction. So Ellis Hartley, who you'll be reading this week, he would be one of those. Another one's Algernon Blackwood, and then there's also E.F. Benson, W.W. Jacobs, Barry Payne, Robert Barr. So these are sort of combination fiction writers. From Henry James, and this focus on kind of how the ghost story starts to suggest instead of to state. And so there's these hints, there's just implication, and that takes over the form of the story. What really shook up storytelling, a narrative in this genre, is the occurrence of World War I. The real change in the traditional ghost story came with the upheaval of the First World War, making 1914 an appropriately symbolic termination point for the Victorian ghost story. After the deluge of 1914, the ghost story withered for a time in the face of greater nightmares, but it was quickly to revive and indeed achieved a second great flowering with new themes, new modes of expression, and new images of supernatural volition. Amazingly, the thing to conclude from how ghost stories survived all of these shaking historical events and changes to the forms of literature is just this underlying truth. The belief in ghosts outlasts everything. And of course, even a belief in ghosts, even the literary presence of a belief, is a peculiarly resilient one, culturally speaking, and provides a potent fictional dynamic that seems continually attractive to both writers and readers. I think that the bottom line is your readers, those who pick up the ghost story, they want to be convinced. They want to believe in this possibility of the wraiths that follow the body beyond the lifespan. Elizabeth Bowen, who wrote The Demon Lover, another one of the writers who was both in the literary fiction camp and the ghost story camp in the mid-20th century, said this: the universal business of our century looks like providing ghosts with a propitious climate, hitherto confined to antique manors, castles, graveyards, crossroads, yew walks, cloisters, cliff edges, moors, or city backwaters, They may now roam at will. They do well in flats, are villa dwellers. They know how to curdle electric lights, chill off heating, or decondition air. Long ago, they captured railway trains and installed themselves in liners' luxury cabins. Now, telephones, motors, planes, and radio wavelengths offered them self-expression. The advance of psychology has gone their way. The guilt complex is their especial friend. And I think I will stop there because that run of imagery relates to your first prompt, which I'm asking you to provide a list of objects, spaces that remind you of the ghost story, and to see what turns up when you jog your mind on that question. So thank you for joining me for this introduction to the Victorian ghost story, and we'll be moving quickly into the 20th century next week. Thank you.